I don't know if you've been to an exhibition opening. Like a lot of people are already in their groups and their niches and trying to, it's kind of like, I imagine this is what guys feel like when they're trying to hit on girls in a bar, where you have a motive and you go there and everyone's already got their own business going and it's a really busy night, so understandable. So I'm like, yeah, no, that's not how I'm going to do it.
Before we get started on today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the land of the Darug people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respects to our elders past and present and the next generation coming through. Now, onto today's episode. We're joined in this episode by Nancy Yu, aka NC Chin, a Sydney-based cast glass artist and sculptor. Nancy creates glass weaponry exploring concepts of history, heritage, and psychology. With her long list of accolades that include winning the National Emerging Art Glass Prize in 2020 and the Vicki Torr Prize in 2021. Her incredible work has been featured nationally across La Trobe Art Institute, the Wagga Wagga National Art Glass Museum, and Bankstown Art Centre. She's also featured internationally at the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Architecture in Britain. As we know, becoming an artist has its feats, so in this episode, we talk to Nancy about her journey in building her career and how her parents have supported her along the way. Nancy also takes us through her time at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in China, the inspiration behind all of her very labour-intensive but spectacular artworks, and importantly, how she's able to make a living as an artist. Enjoy the episode.
Do you find Asian Australian artists tend to keep to themselves? Like they sort of, like, you know, there's the art side and there's the business side of art. You can be a great artist.
Yeah.
But you might not be very good at promoting yourself or marketing, you know, your art pieces.
I feel like when you're an artist, you kind of have to take on all these different roles to survive. So like I often talk about artists having a lot of different hats, and we often don't like value ourselves as much outside of just like our art production, but we also all have to, even though it's like something that I know a lot of artists dislike, we have our social media that we have to upkeep. So we're kind of like marketing ourselves, and then we have to go to gallery openings to network. And so we're also like communicators, networking all the time. And we're also fantastic project managers because we're making work and we're like working towards exhibitions from start to finish. So we have to be really great at time management as well, on top of like being masters, like, or trying to be masters of our craft. Like, so there's a lot of skills that you have to develop as an artist, as well as like writing, because you have to write for so many proposals that you don't realize is tacked on to the name of being a professional artist. But once you, or at least in the 21st century, but once you take on that role, you realize there is a lot more work than just making art. And that's when you start to kind of, even if you're not good at these, like you're not a particularly extroverted person, you have to kind of push yourself out there and find ways to kind of get involved with the art community and art scene in your own way. Like for me, I'm not a particularly extroverted or social person. I'm more introverted, but even so, I feel like as an artist, one thing that you should be confident about is talking about your own art, because confidence comes from knowledge, and there's no one who knows as much about your art than yourself, because you're like, it's your art.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes, and because like naturally, because I'm in business, you know, the question that comes to my head is, do artists usually hire, you know, a team, or do they have anyone who helps them, or do you just like, are artists just perpetually like just managing everything, like wearing all hats in the business?
Pretty much. Unless like I know very few artists, maybe at some point when we're like rich,
really big, right?
Got a lot of money, and then money makes money. Can outsource everything, outsource labor, outsource work, and then we can like let go of those like pieces that we don't like, you know. Social media, for example, first one off the list. Being our own accountants, first one off the list. Until we get to that point, we do have to wear all those hats. And we're basically, I really do see ourselves as entrepreneurs. There's this new idea that artists in the 21st century aren't just, that romanticized idea of artists locked up in the studio all day. They are artist entrepreneurs, and they're like creating like I guess a niche, like a space for themselves that they can reach out.
Like it's not either artist or business. Like you can be an artist and a business owner.
Because also I think with being being an entrepreneur, one thing that you have to have is vision and what was the other thing? You have to have vision and creativity. And I think that's kind of like where artists excel. So it's not that far stretch to marriage those two together.
Well, Viv and I were we were in Carlingford getting yumcha, and like anyone who's been to Carlingford
Village.
Carlingford Village is just old, dilapidated. I feel like it has not changed since the 1980s. Carlingford is obviously naturally a lot of Asians, and there were we noticed a lot of art classes in there. So a lot of Asian parents take their kids there to do art. And I think you did. But you did do art as well.
No, I did it there. So they have one studio there. They've opened up a recent one now. I don't know if you're familiar with the Carlingford Village one.
I'm not familiar.
Not from the area.
Yeah, fair enough. But the artist who runs it, so I think he was trained traditionally in China, and his name is David Chen, and he does a lot of like sketching and a lot of painting. But like you were saying, everyone who was in the area took their kids to Mr. Chen's place to do art. He was nice, but it was like he was very traditional, like, do this is bad. Like he doesn't sugarcoat anything. It's like if you sketch a line wrong, he's like, why is this so bad? Like do better. And then he's like, you need to work on this next week. And like all the kids from that area went to him, and then they just progressively work their way through from primary school all the way up until year 12. Most of them do their HSC work there. But yeah, what were you saying?
Well, so I have this thing where Asian parents for some reason love to take their kids to do like art classes. But then all of a sudden when you want to make it a career, it flips. They're like, no, you can't make a career out of it. So did you growing up have that somewhat of a similar pathway, or you just always into art? Like what's the sort of upbringing there before you got to where you got to now?
Well, I guess like I've always had an interest, like a natural inclination to be drawing as a kid, like all the time watching Sailor Moon, watching cartoons and drawing them. And so I've always had that inclination. I did do drawing outside of like, school in Hurstville. So kind of like a similar situation with my teacher was Paul Shen, and I had one before that who was called John. And they're also from that kind of Chinese kind of institutional art background. Though the way they taught it seemed to be a lot chilled out, more chilled out. I remember when I was when I was in Paul's class back in high school, there would be a range of ages in the class. So some of us were just like sitting down very quietly, sketching, like mimicking this other painting or image that we were doing for 2 hours. And then there would be little kids and they'd be running around. I feel like art for them, for Asian parents, the way they put their kids into kind of like outside extracurricular art school and piano school is more like kind of like an after-school activity, like a after-school activity.
That's academic.
Yeah, exactly. You learn something at the same time, so it's not a waste of time. And it's like
it's not gaming or something.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
That.
It's like kind of babysitting, but like so I can do my own thing, but you're learning something at the same time. So I definitely had that kind of, I guess, friction with my parents when after like I took those classes, I became like more and more interested and serious. And I feel like I was kind of honing my talent as a young bud. So I became quite serious about pursuing art or a direction in art. Like after high school.
Well, I was going to ask you in terms of upbringing, did your parents have much influence on you? What was that like sort of growing up, and what was childhood like for you?
My parents had, I guess I grew up with, when I was like, before when I was 3 years old, 2 years old, I'm not sure, I was sent to China to kind of passed around between my relatives as my dad was, and my parents were developing like a textiles factory in Australia. Mm-hmm. So, they didn't have that much time. And with Chinese parents, the modus operandi is to kind of like have the grandparents take care of the children. Time with them. So, yeah. So once I came back to Australia, like apparently I didn't even recognize my parents.
Oh. How old were you? Were you 2 or 3, you said?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I was in China for quite a while, and I was like, who are these people? But yeah, they won me over by giving me a lot of like gorilla plushies.
Oh my God. Did they visit you during that time period at all, or was that just completely yourself in China with your relatives?
I'm not sure. I don't remember that far. I have very flashes of memories. Maybe they did, but like since I was passed around between so many of my relatives, I don't remember. And you know how like there's a lot of visitors with Chinese relations. So I probably, if they did visit, I'd probably be like, this is just another auntie, another distant auntie.
I don't know my relationship with
Don't know who. But like, yeah, once I came back, they were strict, but like they weren't that strict. It would, like the way that I would describe it, or they would describe their parenting with me, is like a fang yang, where they pretty much just gave me free. I was a free range child.
So if I'm understanding translation correctly, it's like letting the sheep out into the paddock and just free roam?
Pretty much.
Right, okay, yeah.
Until like, you know, those kind of tests came in, and I was especially bad at science. and because, you know, I don't remember if they still have that or not, but there was like a New South Wales little kind of science competition.
Oh yeah, I used to have to do that. Like the ICAS?
Yeah, I think so. And in like year 5 or 6 or year 4, I can't remember. And apparently I got participation. And then that's when they're like, all right, time to put you through all this schooling. You're doing terribly. But yeah, I would say that I had a very free range type childhood, even though they still put me through like a lot of coaching and Chinese school and stuff like that. But it was more, I felt like it was more of a babysitting, but like educational babysitting, just like that.
like many Asian parents. And then which high school did you go to?
St. George Girls.
St. George Girls.
Yeah.
And you completed high school, and then what degree did you do?
So after high school, I went to China for a gap year. I was already considering going to Bachelor's of Visual Arts or teaching education at that time. But when I was in China, I went to a few kind of like art schools for a bit, like that was more like art boot camp for a bit. And then my dad was like, since you're already there, you might as well take the entrance exam for CAFA, the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. Like I figured that, you know, chances that I would get in were very small because it's a really prestigious school. But I was like, all right, why not? That was an experience of itself.
Was it tough?
Yeah.
Okay. So the entrance exam, because we were in the international students, so we had a much better condition than what the domestic students. But even so, it was like in the height of Chinese summer. So it was like really humid and hot. And then they put us into a really small room, pretty much like half, like up to this size, this room. Okay. And there were like 20 of us, and half of the room was sectioned off for the model or the platter of like food and still life. So it was like 3 hours sketching, 3 hours gouache painting, 15 minutes real life sketching, like quickly 素描. And during that time, each time you take a number out of a bucket, and the front row of people, which was like 10 people, were able to sit down with like their wooden, I guess, drawing boards on their knees, and they'd just be drawing and sketching and stuff. And the people at the back had to stand with their backs literally against the wall, and their easels in front of them to paint. So it was very cramped. It was, and once you go in, you can't really go out until the end of the session, which is 3 hours. You can't go for any bathroom breaks at all because there's no
bathroom breaks.
You can't go out.
You physically can't go out.
Physically can't go out. Otherwise, everyone will be like giving you dirty looks. It's like, it's a very intense, quiet drawing, quiet painting, and also like. For the gouache painting, generally you had a bucket of water, and generally that bucket gets like dirty quite quickly, so you want to change the water. But in this situation, you can't change the water. So in that 3 hours, you just use that one bucket of water until you finish. But yeah, so in the end, I was like getting ready to head back to Australia, and the results came out for the entrance exam, and apparently I made it in, and I was actually like number 1 or 2.
Wow.
For the international students. So, yeah, just not domestic. I'm not competing with a lot of people. And I was surprised, but like I was like, okay, well, since I made it in, then I guess I should go. So I ended up studying there for 1 year before I was like, I can't take this anymore. I want to come back.
You didn't finish it?
No. I found like the education in China and the education in Australia like is very, very different. For the art education in China, it is so focused on technical ability, which is fantastic, which was what I was looking for when I felt like when I was studying in Australia, I lacked that. It was like, where's the foundations,
so
guys?
Opposite.
It was the complete opposite, but there was no emphasis on creativity, no emphasis on concept at all. And I felt like I was missing a lot of that while I was in China. And the reason why I say that there's no emphasis on creativity is that they have very much like this, you don't want to be the nail sticking out.
So like tall poppy syndrome type?
Yeah, very much. So basically, like for example, like they don't say it outwardly, but it's the overall pressure from your cohort that you feel. Like the way that they structured the first year is the foundational year, is they have a subject. I feel like the first couple of weeks was sketching for 2 weeks on one subject, or was it 1 week on one subject? And each session was like 4 hours, and you can come in afterwards to do more touching up and stuff like that. But basically, if everyone else was doing an A1 sketch, you felt like you wanted to try something else, you want to do an A3. No, you can't do that, because every time, every single work was marked out of 100, and those results were publicized on a board, so you knew what was coming.
Made it really academic in a way.
Yeah, it was very academic, and those marks aren't there just for show either, because at the end of the year, they basically call you out by ranking, and you choose your department then. So a bit of a public humiliation as you know,
but that,
Chinese community.
That flies in the face of, I feel like with artistic expression, that if everyone is doing the same thing, then how is it that they can foster people to actually create real and genuine art? Like, doesn't it, like, is that why you, like, I don't know how to frame this up, but that would sound really contradictory to me. And I can certainly, based on what you just told me, I can understand why you probably didn't want to keep going, because you just become commoditized. Like everyone can just do the same thing, and therefore you are just another chess piece that can create the same type of art.
I absolutely felt that. So, because I felt my style too was changing more and more to suit the taste.
Do you think it was being beaten out of you? Like, you know how like people say like creativity gets beaten out of kids when they're young? Like kids are really creative and they do a whole bunch of, you know, interesting things. And then when they go to school and over time, it sort of almost becomes, everyone becomes similar.
Yeah.
Everyone becomes homogenized, right? So you felt that way when you were going through that process?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely felt like over the course of a year, I was feeling my edges were filed down more and more. And so like I felt like, you know, I want to pursue the things that I want to pursue. I definitely see the value of putting of the way that they teach as well, because the idea is that they want you to get to a level high enough foundationally and technically that you can express yourself however you want. But at the same time, this is where it's kind of contradictory. All the students there are already the top of the cream in all of China. Like there would be students who would take the examination 13 years in a row to get into CAFA. So literally everyone was already really good. And I felt like I really needed to work hard to, you know, keep up with these people while I was there. But, you know, it's been a couple of years since I've come out of that uni, and a lot of my cohort have gone out into the world. And I found that a lot of the artists who had the most talent in terms of technical ability and, you know, the marks at the time, not necessarily the artists who made the biggest splash in the Chinese art world afterwards. They might more likely became teachers who kind of...
They were technicians.
But like in terms of that creative, there wasn't that fostering of concept of actually having something to say in their art, which I think is, while like technical ability is fantastic, it's a tool for communication. If you're only using flowery language, but the content is nothing, then there's no point. Like the art loses its soul. So for me, coming back to Australia as well was about kind of making sure that I'm fostering that conceptual side and feeding that conceptual side.
Why did you decide after graduating high school that you wanted to go to China?
Definitely because like I wanted to go to somewhere that taught technical ability.
So there was some intention behind it.
There was definitely intention. I was thinking France, but I'm like so far away. don't know anyone.
Flight, yeah.
And also, you know, I think it's already unusual for my parents to give me that gap year to travel immediately out of high school. I was very sheltered. I didn't even know how to take like money out of an ATM. So I had a lot of my first experiences in China. So the only way that my dad would have been okay with me going, like leaving the nest, would be going to China.
Going to the motherland.
Going to the motherland. So where he had a lot of contacts, a lot of aunties, and I had a lot of relatives, a lot of his ex-girlfriends.
He was a womanizer, was he?
Such a Casanova. So there was one joke where one of the aunties is like, so does your dad have like a girlfriend currently? And I lost track. So I'm like, he's always got girlfriends. So many of them, 100 of them. And she was like, apparently she went back to my dad and was like, your daughter said all this bad. You're a sleaze. You're terrible. And I'm like, I didn't know. I was a kid.
Can't help it.
I ratted my dad out.
Just going back to your dad as well, and just backtracking a little bit before university, how you started exploring art. And you mentioned in our call previously that there was a little bit of friction between telling your dad that you wanted to pursue art and him being against it, or your parents being against pursuing arts, I guess. Did they want you to be or go down a traditional pathway, and how did you convince them that you wanted to pursue art?
Yeah, so like being that I have Asian parents, they obviously wanted me to like, go be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, accountant. And because my marks are fairly good, so when I kind of broke the news that I want to be a high school art teacher, they were not very keen on that idea. And I only said high school art teacher because I was like, well, saying directly that I want to be an artist is a bit too harsh. A reality change for them because they were always talking about how hard it was to be an artist. Over the course of a year, during like my final year, year 12, I was able to convince my dad slowly. So when I first brought out my grand plan, we had like pretty much a screaming match towards, and because my dad and I are both very stubborn and very outwardly stubborn as well. So with my brother, he tends to be much more when he's angry, he will give you like the silent treatment. Internalizes. And then months later, he's still giving you the silent treatment. And you're like, why are you angry, Neil? Tell me why. Whereas I'm the type, if like, I want to sort things out right now, and I don't want to drag it out, and I want to like, so in that way, it started off calmly, but gradually escalated. But over the time, like over the course of the year, I managed to wear him down.
So it wasn't just once, it was like constantly. Yeah.
So I would say, I would be targeting specific reasons, like, being an art teacher, you get all these holidays, like every term you get a holiday, and I can be making money at the same time. I don't need that much money. And whereas doctors, so much stress, you have someone's life in your hands. All the lawsuits, think about it. So I put all of that kind of debating kind of techniques into use, like over the course of years. So by then, after 1 year, he was really thinking, yeah, so much stress being a doctor.
Oh, you literally brainwashed him. Like, you're like propaganda, like, lobbying.
Yeah, the velvet glove first, the iron hammer. But yeah, because I often talk about this concept of what Bruce Lee says, like, be like water, right? And I feel like if you want to convince someone, you have to kind of see them. It has to be a long process where, at the beginning, where they're like completely opposite to where you want to be, they're like at the state of ice. And you have to kind of shock that and melt that slowly, and then eventually have a mold ready for them to fall into, and then turn into that ice.
So your dad was that ice, and basically you molded him into what you wanted him to be?
I think that's the case for everything. Mm-hmm. And that's how that's parenting as well. So it goes both ways. How he molds me into how he would like me to be, but the relationship is not like a one-way street, because there is that kind of level of communication and trust that you can generally talk to your parents, and they're not completely unreasonable people. In the beginning, they might completely disagree with you, but over time, if they see like the amount of like how serious you are, how dedicated you are, they want to support you too. And I found that he is one of my staunchest supporters right now these days, where he's helping me build a studio at home. And nice. Every time I'm installing for solar, he's always like, can I help? Aww. Can I do something? And for my first solar at Gallery Lane Cove, it was like an intense 3-day install, and he was there helping me the entire time. And they were like really heavy in stores too. So I think, you know, like there is that kind of relationship that you have to build as a kind of, I guess, as anyone.
So was that, I mean, over that year of, you know, him finally accepting that you're going to be an artist, was he still quite lukewarm, or by the end of that 1 year he was very much so like, yes, this is a great, you know, career for you?
Yeah, he was very much, yes, it's a great
you
career.
wore him down good.
I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have gone to China.
Yeah.
He also made it into ArtExpress as well. Was that the tipping point or the cherry on top for him?
Yeah. I think that for him, like, you know, I think Asian parents are very much about milestones. If you hit this milestone, then it symbolizes something. It represents something that, yes, you have a bit of talent.
So for context, because I know, like, I don't know what ArtExpress is. So why is ArtExpress such a big deal?
So ArtExpress is basically in year 12 for your HSC, you make a body of work. And if it's, how would you describe it? Like if it's like really good, I guess.
It's dependent on the theme of, it's in Art Gallery of New South Wales, I think.
I think it's Art Gallery of New South Wales, and there's also a couple other regional galleries.
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
So it's almost like they have a theme for that year, and then whoever the best HSC body of work or what the judges think matches that theme the best, usually they get displayed for a few months. But it's all year 12 students.
And that display is called ArtExpress?
ArtExpress.
Okay, gotcha. So it's like the cream of the crop for that theme for that year.
Yep.
And then you obviously, so what was that piece that you did and what was the theme?
It was Matchbox Factory. What I did was a painting, a fairly large painting and a few smaller sculptural pieces beside it, where my theme was kind of imagination, or this, it was actually, this wasn't the ideal piece I would have wanted to show.
Tell us more.
So originally in year 12, I had, and this is where my affinity to glass started actually. I wanted to make this a glass sculpture of a woman emerging out of a body of water, kind of like the scene of rebirth and scene of imagination. And I did have part of that woman in the painting, but, you know, but when I was like talking about this idea to my art teacher at the time, she was like, I don't think she even heard of glass art. So she didn't even know it existed. And I didn't even know it existed either. So I'm like, but I had only just recently learnt about the theory of bronze casting, which is a lost wax casting. And I'm like, glass can't be that different. And yes and no. And now that I'm actually working with this technique, I'm like, yes, you're right.
Vastly different.
But you're so naive. So she had the right idea. She was like, you paint so well, and we don't have the resources for this. So I'm like, okay, I guess I'll stick with painting. And at that time, I hadn't even done any sculpting. To say that I was going to make this entire sculpture out of glass, you know, it was a bit of a fast stretch. But I actually, because like, you know, I think YouTube was already out during that time, during my high school years. And there was this series by Philip Farrow or something on how to sculpt. And so I did a lot of my sculpting is self-taught via like
YouTube.
online tutorials, YouTubes.
Like many people now, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like right now we as people who live in the age of information, you can learn anything really, and it's more about having access to resources. That is what like going to uni and knowing the finesse, like talking to technicians, knowing how to finesse that going to uni and these like schools of art that really bring value.
So the love of or the interest in glass art was ignited during year 12. And then you went to China to do fine arts and specialize in fine arts.
Yeah.
Then how did you make the transition from fine arts into exploring glass art finally?
After my final year, my first year and final year at CAFA, I did get into the department I wanted, which was sculpture, but I came back home briefly and I was like, every year is going to be full of marking. And I was looking at options of, it's also more expensive being an international student. So I was thinking logistically as well. And it's also the access to information in China that I felt very limited by. Mm-hmm. So there aren't as many libraries in China as there are in Australia. And YouTube just doesn't really work. So when I came back to Australia, I was looking into options and I found that in SCA, which is Sydney College of Arts, part of Sydney Uni, has a department of glass. And I was quite interested in that. So I put in glass painting and applied for that. And in the first year there, I actually did painting because they didn't have a glass studio. Because too few people from my cohort applied for glass. I think including me, only 3 people. Yeah. So, but I was already while I was painting, I was already starting to look over there and trying to find a way to weasel into glass. And in my second year, they combined sculpture, glass, ceramics into one area, one department, because they were already starting to downsize. They were originally separate departments, and this is when the school is going on a downward trajectory. Yeah.
Logistically, would that have worked with ceramics, glass and sculpture together?
I found it was a really fantastic year. My second year of uni I did learn a bit of glass. It was mostly from electives, but you also had access to ceramics and sculpture. So in my free time, which I have a lot of because it was all I was only studying. I was constantly chasing down the technician to teach me various techniques. And I feel like if you want a good education, as in art school, or at least from my experience, you have to chase down everyone.
Yeah. You can't expect it to be fed to you.
Yeah, they're always busy, and so I always made these projects based on what new technique could I learn. So I definitely learned a lot during those 2 years I was in sculpture. But yeah.
This episode is produced and brought to you by Social Wave. Social Wave is a strategic content marketing agency helping businesses grow revenue using video, podcasts, and SEO. Head on over to socialwave.com.au to find out more. Now back to the show.
Working with glass, can you explain a little bit about glass? Because I certainly hadn't heard of glass sculpting until I actually, saw your work. And obviously there are really sort of nuances to glass that's sort of unique to glass as well. So can you explain what it's like working with glass?
It's very precarious working with glass, and not only because it breaks easily. So a lot of people probably are familiar with hot glass, which is glass blowing. Which we had the studios for it, and I did try it for one elective and I was like, this is not for me. With my work, casting is also labor intensive, but it doesn't require as much. It's much slower. Whereas in hot glass, you can get something out within the span of 4 hours, but you can also work for the span of 4 hours. And then right when you're putting something away, it gets too cold and it shatters right in front of you.
Yeah.
It's and I found that I just didn't have the temperament for hot glass. Whereas with my work, I can work for a month, and then afterwards, I find out that it's failed. But I can deal with that. So. With my process, basically I would sculpt the object that I want, because also I find myself, even though I work with glass, I'm much more of a sculptor. And I would sculpt it in clay first, then I would make a silicone mold of that. And after that, I would pour hot wax into that silicone mold until it solidifies. And then I make an investment mold. And after that, I would steam the wax out. And then that investment mold, once it dries, is the one.
What's an investment mold?
So an investment mold in bronze would be like made out of ceramic. In glass would be made out of plaster and silica. So it's a much softer material, so it can breathe with the glass. But that also makes it much weaker. So it can, like in a week-long firing or a month-long firing in the kiln, it can easily break down and for glass to leak out. And that's why you have that kind of 40 to 60% rate of failure with casting. That mold only lasts once. So that's a mold that goes into the kiln, or the oven, where you put the glass in, and you'd put in a program. Generally, for casting, you want at least 1 week to, could be like, there was a telescope that the firing schedule was like half a year or a year or something.
Whoa.
And then that's the funny story. They had a power outage.
Oh, no.
And then when it came out, there was like a huge crack down the middle.
No.
So they had to repeat the process all over again.
Far out.
And you find that more, you prefer that over like blowing glass for like 4 hours and...
It's different. The pain is different.
The pain's different. Yeah. Wow.
So, but yeah, so it definitely has quite a bit of pain, because like in my final year where I was making my body of work, my graduation piece in 2015, there I had 2 major fails in the kiln and this is why you shouldn't be rushing glass as well. And I was also I think it was a way too ambitious project for my level of skill at that time, is that the mold broke down and all the glass flooded out. And so I didn't have what I wanted to show in my final body of work. But the project I was working on was called Icarus, and it is about the idea of failing and ambition. I was like, wow, isn't this just perfect? so on theme, through gritted teeth. But yeah, I found that it's very reflective of, like, a lot of my art is very reflective of my life.
You can tell she's a glass artist. Reflective.
It really shows, represents my life at the time.
Can you tell about this particular piece? Like, what's this piece called, and how did you create this particular piece? What's the process there?
Okay, so this piece is a fairly recent, like a cute little piece that I did using recycled glass.
What's it called?
So it's called Smiling Axe.
Cute.
Because I'm quite inspired by kind of like historic narratives. And this one is actually a facsimile of a bronze kind of axe during the Shang dynasty. And it was kind of like a companion piece to another piece of like this fairly large axe found in the tomb of Fu Hao. So like what I found really interesting about kind of like using historic narratives is that I find these kind of both like myths and legends and real history are so interconnected, and they're very much still alive, I find, today, because it kind of tells a very human story that is relatable. That axe, I actually based it off on the original dimensions, and it ended up being like around 39.5 by 37.5 centimeters, and then it was 9 kilos.
Wow.
So exact weight as well.
Yeah,
wow.
Exact weight was 9 kilos, and you could really see the heaviness in glass, because the original one would have been in bronze. So with the glass being lighter than bronze, it was like around like 3 centimeters thick.
Okay.
And that would have been an axe that would have that Fu Hao would have held it. And Fu Hao, to give you a bit of background, is a woman who was one of the 64 concubines of the king back then, and who eventually made her way to second queen. And she was also a priestess and mother and a general. So she actually commanded an army 13,000 kind of strong, and was incredibly powerful for that time, which was still very much a patriarchy. So I found those kind of stories to be really inspirational and interesting to work with and kind of reflect on contemporary issues as well, because it was also during a period of time where women's rights in America, around the world, we felt like we're kind of diminishing, like reproductive rights, for example. So I was really looking to these kind of historic figures, female figures that were really strong in their own right, and really looking into different power dynamics, I suppose.
Does most of your art have a general, I guess not theme, but follows this similar idea and concept as well in terms of exploring historical figures and the same women?
Yeah, because I think a lot of Nancy's art, the one thing that stuck out for me when I first saw it was I'm a sucker for ancient history as well, particularly Chinese history. So, all of your art pieces that I saw were very much so motifs and, symbolic of that time. And a lot of that stuff is beautiful because I've spent extensive time in China as well. And I find it going off tangent here, like a real shame that, certainly during the Cultural Revolution, the Red Army would go through and sort of destroy a lot of historical artifacts. And then spending time in Taiwan, where Taiwan now has actually a lot of Chinese ancient artifacts and things like that even the mainland doesn't have. But anyway, going back to it is that's what caught my eye, because number one, never seen anyone really do glass art quite like that. But number two, not that I'm an art aficionado or anything, but number two is doing it in something that I personally was interested in, because I'm not someone who's I can appreciate art, I guess. But, even if we talked about contemporary art, and sometimes things that can be a bit more abstract, it's quite hard for the average sort of general audience to appreciate sort of the work and the thinking behind the art as well. But this was something that I was immediately drawn to. So I think going back to Viv's question, is this drawn from your own sort of interest and love for, ancient history, particularly more in China? And, what's that sort of, how did that all come about?
There's so much to unpack in what you just said. I'm definitely someone the Chinese would describe as 念旧, which is this idea of sentimental, loving the past. And I often like referring not just to Chinese kind of history, but also Greek history, mythology and stuff like that as well. So for me, the piece that you probably saw was parts of the glass armor.
Yes.
So that piece is actually something I'm still currently working on this year, that I'm hoping to finish for my end of the year project. And it's a very personal piece, and it definitely draws from Chinese history. And it's a piece about about the heritage that we have. So to give you a bit of background, the backstory of the inspiration of this piece, there was a time right after in 2015 or something, when I was going through my first real heartbreak, where I found myself very, it's not an uncommon experience, but I found myself very isolated and very alone. And I felt like I couldn't really reach out to anyone for help, even though I was surrounded by friends and family who would happily have helped me. But there was that kind of sense of dignity or ego, and where I felt like if I reached out to someone, then that image of me would shatter. And I would be defined only by that flaw from thenceforth, and which is weak and so broken.
Yeah.
But so So that really affected my mental health. So I was always like holding it in, and I'm also more of a thinker than a feeler as well. So I was trying to rationalize my way out of things. I was thinking about that kind of connection between pride and shame, about like pride being the source of shame. And I remember distinctly, I was writing in my journal, because I'm a journalist, of course, about there's this entry where I was talking about this idea of my pride being like a suit of glass armor, where it was weighing down on me, and the first real impact that it gets, it would shatter and cut into me. And that's kind of like the inspiration behind it. And I found, so like I started developing this work over the course of the years, this idea more and more. And I was relating it back into what kind of like heritage that is passed on to us by our parents, like, because, we only have these sources of shame and this ideal that we want to live up to because that's how we're brought up to be, and that's how our culture tells us to be. Like, don't lose face. And I felt very much like if I was reaching out, if I got therapy, and I never ended up getting therapy because of that, but I read a lot of self-help books, so it's okay.
Rationalize your way through it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
I got through it. So I lost track of what I was saying.
So it was the piece that was.
Yes. Yeah. So I was talking about the heritage, and I looked into stories, like historic stories, where you kind of see these values of pride being passed down, and certain certain values being passed down, certain values that we consider as strong or important. And the two characters that stood out to me, even though there were a lot of characters throughout Chinese history, especially because I was interested in the history of the Three Kingdoms during that time, was Guan Yu and Zhang Fei. So they were two vassals and sworn brothers of Liu Bei, who was commanding Shuhan during the Three Kingdom period. And they've been elevated to be considered guardian gods, so Mention, and you'd see them in front of like temples, kind of their carvings and stuff like that. And they were very like fierce warriors and generals during their time, and they won a lot of important battles. But what I was interested in was not like the traditional notion of what they represented. Like, as soon as my parents see these characters, they would immediately associate them with value and with like loyalty, fierceness, and
they had different connotations too.
And pride. And for me, what struck me about their stories was actually towards the end of their lives, their deaths, actually. So for me, both of them as heroes also had a fatal flaw. For Guan Yu, it was his pride, and for Zhang Fei, it was his wrath. So Guan Yu eventually became so arrogant that he stopped listening to the advice of the strategists around him, and due to that, he lost Jingzhou, which was like a really important strategically important city, and as well as walking himself into an ambush. So that's how he met his death. And then Zhang Fei, because he was like the sworn brother of Guan Yu, he ended up being so depressed over his brother's death that he ended up starting to abuse his men more and more until they eventually couldn't take it anymore and mutinied against him in the middle of the night.
Wow.
With those kind of like two values of pride and wrath, we generally see them as very kind of strong characteristics, strong values in I guess, traditional Chinese viewpoint, and it's probably what made them really strong warriors in the first place. But it was also like a deadly flaw to have. So I found those to be like kind of themes that tied back into my suit of armor, and that's why I have imagery of them throughout the armor, to talk about that kind of idea of the armor, of this idea of pride and ego being something that like we feel holds us up and protects us, because it might protect you, like the suit of armor. It's very thick glass, and it's very heavy to a certain degree, but like the way that the symbolism of it being in glass is that there's that materiality where it actually can hurt you wearing it, and there is that burdensome nature to it. So yeah.
And like telling these stories just then, you know, you had to sort of explain that at length. When you were first starting out doing these pieces, how difficult or how hard was it to get noticed, you know, by things like galleries and museums and anyone who was a curator? You know, like, I guess the question is like, how did you start to get noticed as an artist and then eventually start to, you know, get more involved?
I think being an artist, it's like, I used to think like, you know, you'd reach these milestones and the floodgates would open. It's not like that at all.
Just to be clear.
Just to be clear, for those who want to, you know, pursue art, I recently found this kind of analogy where it's more like a network, where one opportunity eventually leads to another opportunity, and which might branch out into two more opportunities, and eventually you won't have to we still need to put a lot of effort in, but it's kind of like an exponential growth from that first really hard effort that you put in. So Neil Gaiman, who's a writer, said it really well. In the beginning of your career, you probably have to like send out 100 bottles into the sea, and only maybe one of them would come back. So you deal with a lot of rejection in the beginning of your career. And then until eventually the more bottles you put out, 10 of them start coming back, until all of them start coming back. And then you actually have to say no to some, which is unusual, which you feel like, wow, this has never happened to me. I feel like it's very much along those trajectories where, for me, what's always been really important for me as an artist is the work itself. So I think at art schools, a lot of people were saying that, you know, you should be out there networking, going to all these openings, talking to curators and gallerists. But being as someone who is not super socially comfortable.
I thought you were going to say competent for a second. I was like, comfortable is the right word. Yeah.
Like, it's I don't know if you've been to an exhibition opening. Like, a lot of people are already in their groups and their niches, and trying to, it's kind of like trying, I imagine this is what guys feel like when they're trying to hit on girls in a bar, where you have a motive and you go there and everyone's already got their own business going, and it's a really busy night, so understandable. So I'm like, yeah, no, that's not how I'm going to do it. And even if I do talk to a gallerist, I need to have a good portfolio. So that for me, it was always about the work itself. And if the work is good, eventually, like, you know, by putting it out there into art competitions or like, it will get noticed. Someone told me, like a really wise older mentor of mine told me, not that old if she's listening, that that like, you know, someone's always looking, like even though you feel like you're working alone in the studio and no one's noticing, someone's noticing. That advice gave me a lot of confidence, or not confidence, but at least a lot of comfort,
faith, right?
A lot of comfort.
Yeah.
That as long as like you're putting your work out there somewhere, whether it be social media or like into group exhibitions, that it is being noticed as long as the quality of the work is good. And so for me, it was quite important to make a body of work that I was proud of, because if I wasn't proud of, I would be like, I don't want to send it out. Whereas if you're proud of the work, then you're excited to show other people. And I feel like that energy translates when you're reaching out to galleries.
I agree. Like, I think it's not even unique to art. It could be any pursuit that you do. That I think we're in a culture now of instant gratification, where if we don't get the immediate positive signals or the dopamine hits, people just give up and they tap out. And like Seth Godin, he wrote a book called The Dip, which I think about when you were saying that sort of stuff, which is a lot of people give up just before the dip, and you sort of don't know when you're bottoming out. And you might have just been on the precipice of something really great, but you decided to tap out just because you didn't have, the positive signals. I mean, another analogy that I think about is, when you were saying, look, at the start, you sort of like Neil Gaiman example, is like exit velocity. Like when you start up launch a rocket, you have to have a ton of fuel, but as soon as you hit orbit, you don't need that much. And the idea is that most people tend to give up when they're still trying to get through exit velocity. I certainly experience it, whether it's, in business or even marketing for our clients, that they may be doing things for a long, long time without any sort of significant results. But all of a sudden, all it takes is probably one or two successes, and that's like your big breakthrough. That's what people call their big breakthrough as well. Was there a particular moment where you were like, okay, this was the thing that opened up the door that allowed you to do it, or was it very gradual?
I found that it was quite gradual for me. And I can actually track a very clear line within my career. Like I've had so many moments of good fortune in my short career so far, where when I was still like at uni, I was kind of known for being very meticulous and like doing these very slow processes already. So I was noticed by Sarah Humphrey, who was also a student artist at the time, who was working for Kate Baker, my current mentor. And she was looking to go to Canberra, and she was looking for a replacement, kind of like to part-time at Kate Baker's studio. And because I was so meticulous and stuff, she recommended me. And so I started part-timing for Kate. And then after I graduated, Kate gave me a proposition where she said that I could intern at her studio, where I would work 1 or 2 days a week for her. And she would give me a space in the studio. And it's so important as someone working with glass to have that kind of support where they have kiln access, because without a kiln, what can you do? And also all these heavy machinery, like polishing equipment. So that was like an absolute godsend for me. And through like working for her and like helping her, I really saw the value through osmosis even, that how important it was to kind of like that professional practice of persistence, of keeping on going, and that like things happen slowly, and it's like chipping at an iceberg every single day until you eventually get there. And that through helping her, I was helping her install a solar at in Wagga Wagga, actually. So at the National Museum of Glass, where I met Michael Scaroni, and he mentioned, who's the curator there, and he mentioned that there was a art prize for a National Emerging Glass Art Glass Prize. And while I was there, I also kind of saw this work that used like this really beautiful glass. At that time, I was still using soda lime. There's lots of different types of glass, by the way. This beautiful lead crystal glass. So when I first entered it in 2018, when I was a finalist with my glass baby potential. So it's a literal glass baby. Yeah. For people like wondering. During that exhibition, I really was thinking about, I want to transition into this different type of glass. And that's when I asked Michael about it, and I learnt about Blackwood's lead crystal. And that's actually a locally produced glass in Australia, in Victoria. And that's when I transitioned to that glass. And I felt like using that glass is just magic. And I've been using it for my armor series and my helmet series as well. And it really transforms the work into having this sense of heaviness and weightiness and transparency. Like different glass will have different properties. Like for example, the axe head smiling axe, using recycled glass, I can create this effect where that was actually window glass and it now looks completely opaque. And that's because there's a lot of like glass is actually considered, but told to me by my scientist friend, that is actually the second most complex material on Earth to work with, because it's so it's not as well documented as well. So you get all sorts of strange effects if you go to different temperatures, or if the chemical composition is different. And not all glass is compatible either. So you can kind of see just from that. And after that, using that glass and creating the 3 helmets, I won the National Emerging Art Glass Prize. And that also went to Oxford for another art prize.
In the UK?
In the UK,
wow,
yeah,
okay.
at the Ashmolean Museum. So it kind of... I found that there's like this kind of very distinct trajectory where one door open, another door open, or another 2 doors open. And they were just like opportunities of various fates that you could go through, kind of like a video game.
Yeah, little gates that
levels.
Levels, and you level up as you go through it. I know everyone thinks about this, so I hope you don't mind me asking, is how does an artist like yourself earn a living? So how the business side of things, how does it work for you? So
I would say in the first couple of years, it's very difficult. And like a business, the first couple of years when you're working out your own practice, you're working on your own craft, and you're working on like your website, social media and stuff like that, it's very much about investing. And afterwards, once you have kind of like a network and stuff, for me, a lot of times I earn my living from a number of streams. Sometimes I teach a little bit. Other times I rent my work out to galleries. So I get a bit of an artist fee, and I also sell some work, as well as some art prize money, I guess. That's very like, that's not as certain. But yeah, so it's kind of like it all kind of builds up.
Yeah. And now you can basically support yourself as a living to do this full time as well. So I always like to sort of near the end ask questions around if someone was to try and pursue something similar to you, not just in glass, but certainly just make a living out of art. The lesson that I feel like is common, or the theme across all of this, is persistence actually pays a lot in this case. And whether that's through a form of stubbornness, or if it's a form of just being very passionate and devoted to what it is. And I think you have to be proud of what it is that you're creating, that helps push you along, as opposed to just, I guess, proverbially giving up or tapping out in this situation. But do you have any advice? You have a mentor. So if someone says, comes up to Nancy and wants you to be a mentor, what's some of the advice you give to them if they wanted to pursue a pathway like yours? Okay, so if someone wants to be an artist, and I think a lot of artists would agree, is that if there's anything else you would be happy do that. It's a very, very difficult, very trying pathway to go through.
But if it's what you feel like you have to do, and I feel a lot of artists who end up doing it, it's because it's very much in their nature and they'd rather die than not do it. Then you just have to stick with it. You have to be really persistent. You have to numb yourself to rejection and still yourself to rejection, because there's going to be a lot of rejection on the way. But you have to you have to believe in yourself and work on making work that you're proud of, and you have to keep putting yourself out there. And that's the only way that you can kind of work. I guess actually there's a lot of different, I'm giving very general advice because from what I've known for being an artist, but also other artists, is that everyone's pathway is different. And I can't give what worked for me might not work for them.
There's no playbook for it, right?
There's no playbook for it. And you very much have to kind of beat out your own way in the forest until eventually you get to that meeting point with other artists. But yeah, I think there was actually some advice given to me by my uni supervisor when I was in my third year, and I was very anxious about going out and pursuing the role of an artist. And I asked them, so how do I be an artist in the real world? And at the time they gave me an answer that I thought was a total cop-out. And and what they said was that somehow things just end up working out. And I'm like,
what am I supposed to do with this?
So, okay, cool. But after going through, I'm like, yeah, actually things just somehow work out. As long as you're putting in effort, eventually you're not screaming into a void. Eventually it does happen.
Yeah. I think you mentioned you were good fortune, and I'm a big proponent of, whether you call it good fortune, luck, you have to put yourself out there to take advantage of certain situations. So speaking of advantage, one of the other things I wanted to ask you was, as someone who's I'll call myself an art pleb, who just really doesn't know much about art. From an external perspective, I see the art scene as, very stereotypically older, sophisticated, high net wealth people who generally have more money than they know what to blow it on. And I imagine if I were an artist and I needed to get into this circle, a lot of the curators and, the gallerists and these sort of guys, stereotypically, I feel like I like that. So the question I have for you is, as an Asian Australian artist, did you feel like you had any advantages or disadvantages working with, probably a more conservative industry, or were they not conservative? They were quite progressive. Is my complete thought, wrong?
It goes both ways, I think. For me, I have I guess two major niches. One is I work with glass, but and there's pitfalls to that as well, because if you're working with glass, there is this kind of stigma within the art world that you're a craft artist. But then I also work with my culture, and it can automatically be labeled as, just Chinese artist. And it depends on your viewpoint. If you see it as a disadvantage, then it will become a disadvantage for you. But if you see it as an advantage, then it could be your selling point. So I don't know, because if it's all the self-help books I've read in the past talking about mindsets and stuff like that. There was one that I really love by Robert Greene about that helped me through a lot of tough times called Mastery, where he was talking about, was it Thomas Edison or someone whose factory was burning down, and he said to his son, quick, look, you're not going to see a sight like this for a while.
Wow.
What a beautiful fire. I'm like, what positivity. Give me some of that. So for me, it's been an advantage because I found a community within both the glass community and the Asian kind of art community as well. And that's helped open a lot of doors to me. But I'm also looking like, I guess being like more of a thinking type as well. I tend to be a bit strategic. So I'm looking to go into performance, both because I think it would be an interesting direction for my work. And I also wanted to do that performance with the glass armor. So I'm looking into kind of like expanding my community as well. So I think it's an advantage to have these kind of backgrounds and these niches because you can find community within them.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I don't have any other questions. You got any more?
I love listening to all of that, especially the story where you were talking about the background of the Chinese culture and how you've built, how that's come about to inspire your piece with the glass armor. Just to wrap things up, where can we find your work coming up in future gallery exhibitions and also online social media?
Okay. So generally I would have them on my homepage on my website at nchin.com and as well as on my Instagram at nc_chin. But yeah, so generally those are the two places I lurk on.
Do you have any big projects coming up that you can share with us?
Okay, so currently if you're in Melbourne, you can go and see Personal Mythologies curated by Sophia Tai at La Trobe Art Institute in Bendigo. So you do need to take a train trip. As well as...
Oh, when does that run until, the Bendigo one?
October. Okay. So, and there's also one coming up in Wagga right afterwards in October. At the National Glass Museum. So it's called Glass Chrysalis, which will feature 10 notable emerging glass artists. And I will also be, I guess, showing at the grad show at SCA at the end of the year, where I will be looking to perform in my suit of glass armor.
Oh,
nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That'll be exciting. Thanks so much for coming onto the show today, Nancy. We really enjoyed that.
Thanks for coming. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.